Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to start sharing some of the findings of the work that I'm currently completing. I'm not anywhere near where Claire is at the moment in terms of her research. However, I'm kind of halfway through my data collection for my empirical work. What I'd like to share with you today, though, are the findings of some of the brief findings of my systematic review that I completed as part of my PhD, which explored obviously the attitudes, views, etc., and the challenges associated with making non-normative choices and what that looks like within kind of current maternity care. So I'm just going to share my slides now. So I want to share with you initially just some thoughts around choices in maternity care, and Claire's covered off quite a lot of what I would have got into in terms of autonomy and choice and where we sit in terms of the choice agenda within the UK. Currently, we have excellent frameworks within the UK, and despite searching for a global perspective, it's actually quite challenging to find anywhere else within internationally that have the frameworks that have been established within the UK for providing true choice in maternity care. And as we know, that goes back to the early 90s. What we as midwives and clinicians also know is that the reality of providing choice isn't actually aligned with the rhetoric around choices that in particular might challenge clinicians who are working with women and birthing people who might not want to follow guideline or want to make choices that we would necessarily recommend. My interest around this came predominantly from my experiences in supporting women to have home births outside of guidance. And it was very clear to me that there is an emerging evidence base that supports ongoing development around how midwives support those choices, and in particular the kind of bigger choices, and focusing on predominantly, if you look at the research in the UK rather than globally, those focuses are around free birth, water birth after caesarean, things like declining induction, high risk home birth, and a large body of evidence around maternal request caesarean section. But what was really evident is there was no real exploration of how women experience making more discrete choices. So those choices that we don't tend to have the larger discussions around. So it might be the declining of a vaginal examination, declining of screening. Whilst we have a body of evidence that explores decision making for the cohort of women that are having babies, what we don't necessarily understand are the social processes and the decision-making processes around how and why women make decisions to decline care or to not follow recommended guidance. What we do know is that these choices sit not just within a legal, ethical and clinical framework, but choices are made within a social framework as well. So expectations that although we are offering interventions as choices, such as screening, routinely undertaken, taking a blood pressure, auscultation, the social expectation is that people will accept that. When they decline, do we really understand what's going on and why that's happening? Within the UK, the focus, as I say, has been on these more discrete elements of care, and they tend to be focused around birth, mode of birth, place of birth, and within a risk framework. So what I'm interested in is looking at it more holistically, looking along the entire maternity continuum, and seeing where the gaps are. And I use this, or have used this picture of a jigsaw, because actually there are huge gaps. There are elements of experience that we don't really understand, and in order to be able to provide an equitable framework for care, particularly when those choices don't necessarily align with what we would recommend, then we need to truly understand what's going on, which is what my PhD is about. So the first piece of work that I did, which is hopefully due to be published soon, so this is hot off the press, is my meta-ethnography. So in order to define what I mean by non-normative choice, I came up with this really snappy definition. I'm aware it's insanely wordy, but it was quite difficult to pin this down. So the difference between where Claire's work is situated around physiological birth and the pursuit of kind of those protecting that physiological birth is that mine includes interventions that might be requested as well. So here's my review definition. It's a fully autonomous decision made by any woman or birthing person at any point at the childbirth continuum to wholly or in part decline, refuse or request an alternative to routinely offered, clinically indicated or guideline policy mandated recommended care, pathway, physical examination, screening or intervention, place or mode of birth for any reason, and which where uptake or compliance is considered socially accepted norm, or where the choice might be deemed unusual, alternative and unconventional. So I have to do that in two breaths because I can't do that all in one. So my first piece of work was around where has this been explored. So I chose a meta-ethnographic methodology in order to not just thematically analyse, but look at the processes that are going on, and they'll be able to support theory generation, which will hopefully then go on to support my empirical research, which is a grounded theory study. So I undertook a search just over a year ago now, and through the search identified 33 studies that fit the inclusion-exclusion criteria, which were broadly research that had been undertaken post-change in childbirth around 1993 within healthcare systems that were similar to the UK, in order that we could look at similarities, etc. The studies came from the studies that went through that process came from the UK, Australia, Iceland, Sweden, Holland, Norway, Netherlands and Ireland. And as is always the way with these reviews, there has been research published post review, which I'll touch on at the end. Those 33 studies broadly dealt with caesarean section at maternal request in the absence of a clinical indication, birth arrangements against medical advice, declining screening or elements of screening, including declining information around that, declining recommended care or treatment, registered caregivers and interventions, and registered caregivers obviously included the free birth and predominantly in Australia as well, around registrants providing care, so non-registered caregivers, and then place of birth against medical advice. So those of you that are familiar with the meta-ethnographic method, there are 7 canonical stages, which I could talk for about 4 hours on at the moment, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. But essentially it's around the analysis and synthesis of the data within those papers to be able to look at reciprocally or refutationally drawing out concepts. So of those 33 studies, I think I ended up with somewhere in the region of 400 codes, which through the process of going back, working through cyclical comparison, I ended up with 3 reciprocal conceptual categories and 1 refutational conceptual category. So the reciprocal categories are looking at, I'll present them. I think that's probably easier rather than me playing on. Okay, so the three were, the first one was influences and motivations for a non-normative choice. So the studies overall there was a huge amount of kind of core reciprocity, so similarity in terms of the experiences of women making such choices, regardless of what those choices were. Their experiences were incredibly similar, particularly in relation to influences and motivations. So some of this will not be a surprise. So that obviously the women's philosophy, values and beliefs around pregnancy and childbirth heavily influenced how those choices were made, and not just in relation to and this is where I find it quite interesting, to what we assume to be a pushback against the system, but in particular women and birthing people who might request intervention. So in particular things like wanting to birth in a hospital and have as much intervention as possible because their familial experiences and what they'd seen in their family was not a positive experience. So that influenced their decisions, and their philosophy around childbirth. Again, I think we tend to assume with regards to philosophy that women making non-normative choices do so in order to protect birth as almost a sacred passage, a rite of passage. But what I found within these papers was that there were cohorts of women whose philosophy was that they didn't hold pregnancy and childbirth in any particular type of regard, and that influenced an increase in request for intervention. There were obviously social cultural influences, so particularly in relation to screening, whether or not the uptake of screening and declining screening was held with suspicion, which I found again particularly interesting in one or two papers where they felt that screening had a particular gender that was hidden, and therefore they couldn't accept it, couldn't accept screening, or felt they had to decline it because they didn't subscribe to those kind of social cultural agendas, which was I find it all quite interesting. So risk interpretation and safety was one that came up time and time again, which again will not come as any particular type of surprise, but in relation to how women looked at the risks they were being presented and evaluated them in accordance with their own philosophy, values and beliefs, and then that helped with formulating their decisions to say no, or to say actually I'd like as much as I can. Ambivalence came up again and again across all of the papers, really, regardless of whether it was mode of birth, regardless of whether it was screening that was being declined, induction of labour, etc. Because and again that fitted in with the philosophy, values and beliefs, and whether or not they held pregnancy to be a particular rite of passage, or whether actually for them having a healthy baby then was all that mattered, so they would surrender themselves to the medical community. The one that absolutely did not come as a surprise was that a particular influence and motivation was whether or not they had had previous experiences that would potentially re-traumatise them. So they were making choices that were preventative in order to avoid that. And fear of the institution, fear of clinicians, but not just in relation to childbirth and childbearing, but also in relation to previous experiences. There was one study where somebody just wanted to completely avoid any healthcare professional because of their experience as a child and receiving care as a child. I use the analogy of the boiling pot to describe what happened when women came together with healthcare professionals within the institution, and how they described how this influenced their decision making. And this ties in and reflects what Claire was saying about systems that are supportive or not. So they talk of an inflexible, fearful, risk-averse system, and that was reflected, again, regardless of the nature of the choices they were making, the mode of birth, the screening, whether or not it it was induction of labour, etc., and questioning the motivations of the advice that they were being given. For whose benefit was it? Was it because they truly had these risks that they wanted to avoid, or was it to avoid litigation? Was it to avoid any abnormal outcome that would be a problem for the healthcare providers rather than the woman? Working outside policies, procedures and guidelines, finding that they are rigid and that healthcare professionals were unlikely to move outside of them, and having to push back against them. And then the institutional manifestations of care, and Beck Jenkinson in Australia talks of this, and it's reflected in a number of other studies, that there's almost a stepping up of behaviour as those decisions are made, which can start with really subtle undermining of bodily autonomy, all the way up to violence and assault, and many women would reflect on the fact that that was the institution, manifestation of that institutional fear of a poor outcome, and being pushed to comply, which is really sad, really, really sad. The last reciprocal translation came about was knowledge as empowerment, and I found this not surprising, but it was interesting in terms of where information was sought, and particularly in the free birth literature. The information was sought completely outside of the healthcare spectrum, and actually where information was provided, again, it was seen with a degree of suspicion, and healthcare providers were the last people that women were engaging with in order to get a balanced view. And then how women operationalize that knowledge, how did they make those choices, and there was some quite forgotten the word, there's some quite impressive is the wrong word, but being able to challenge those risk recommendations, or challenge the recommendations of healthcare professionals, but then having to use sort of, not underhand, that's the wrong word, but having to use sort of ways to manipulate the system themselves in order to achieve what they needed to, and that broke down trust with healthcare professionals. It's not all bad though, I have to say, because the reputational construct at the end and the translation reflects Claire's and positions Claire's research. This is where that sits, because they do speak across a number of the studies of facilitative healthcare providers and finding a middle ground and being heard and being listened to, and not being written off as just making wild decisions that can be that are dangerous for them or their baby, and recognising that regardless of whether or not their choices could result in mortality or morbidity for them or the fetus, the baby, that they were supportive of that, because they worked within that human rights and kind of relational framework, so they were able to come to a middle ground. So what are the implications then for practice and future research? Well, what came across really strongly was that there was a lack of representation overall in the data from any diverse backgrounds, other than those that were particularly targeted within one or two of the 33 studies. So representation of Black, Asian, diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds, but also within the LGBTQ community. That data either hasn't been collected or hasn't been part of that research. And given the research that came out during COVID, Marie Greenfield's work that has demonstrated that free birth seemed to be an increasing phenomenon within the LGBTQ community, I'm interested to find out whether or not diversity actually plays a part in decision making, and that's part of my ongoing research too. There's wider scope for understanding experiences of non-normative choices that are outside the larger subjects, so the high-risk home birth, the free birth, the maternal request cesarean section, the more discrete choices, the pushing induction back slightly. So whether or not we can understand whether there's commonality to be able to develop more appropriate care for women who make such choices. Recognising that range of routinely presented choices that are presented as choices, but actually socially expected to be accepted. So things like screening, in particular, scans as well. And then there remains a gap in relation to understanding holistic experiences around motivators, institutional, familial and personal reasons behind it. And that's where my empirical research is situated and ongoing at the moment, in order that we can create firm evidence base upon which to predicate equitable care pathways. And that's it. Thank you very much. I've popped a nod into my PhD supervisors just in case they've tuned in tonight, to Sarah, Lindsay and Sally. And I just want to say thank you to all the women of birthing people who are currently contributing to my research. And if you want to get in touch, you can. My email address is there. I like Sue, I'm slightly addicted to Twitter. It is my key procrastinating place. And you can follow the project as well on Twitter and on Insta. Thank you very much.